hundreds of callings about the characters who live among us and with us. Jim Mosby, the personality, manner, and focus, she put both the rank and file and the high and mighty at ease. Enough to talk to her about the most meaningful, intimate, moving, and humorous aspects of their personal lives. Um, Researching her led me next door to the Kalamazoo Public Library, where I found a couple copies of her famous book, The Flat Cat and Other Tales, published by the Gazette in 1976. I always felt that it's too bad there isn't a volume 2 or even a volume 3 of some of her best columns. She's also written another book, Parkview Hills, We Belong to the Land, published in 2008, that tells about how the vision of environmentalist Dr. Louis Batts, a Cork Club member, and his friend Bert Upjohn became the basis for a model community based on the principles of, shall we say, environmentally met and married Jim Walters, her husband, for these many years. Together they moved to Los Angeles, where she completed her bachelor's in English. Malawi. And from 1972 to 1975, she taught English literature and African history at Lafuni Boys Secondary School, Catholic mission school run by Maris Brothers and Priests. And Jim taught science, I learned at the table tonight. Their tour coincided with the climax of decolonization, the end of European empire. Africa was the subject of what is known as the scramble for Africa, the climax of European imperialism between 1880 and 1914, the outbreak of World War I. Well, 1960s, 1970s, when they were in Malawi, was the climax of what has also been called then the scramble from Africa, when in a period of a couple decades, 50 new countries were born, and the map of Africa, drawn in many cases by the Europeans at the end of the 19th century, was then revised to some extent, and certainly changed with new countries and new names of countries during this incredible period. In 1960, France kicked off this decolonization when it freed 14 colonies in 1 year, and the French ultimately were to free, as I remember, about 17 or 18. Britain followed with 18 colonies freed between 1957 and 1975. In 1964, the British Protectorate of Nyasaland, colonized in 1891, therefore they had no history. Therefore they could be colonized and subject to Europe's civilizing mission. Since independence, research over the last 50 years has revealed a new history of Africa. And tonight, Barbara Walters will share what she has learned since she taught the old African history in Malawi all those years ago. So tonight, Barbara, you're on to teach us the new history of Africa. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Howard. And it's so good to see everybody tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry, Ken, that the anatomy of the elephant that is the rear is pointed to you as a new member. I apologize. Larger in life than we can ever imagine, dwarfing our preconceived notions and changing our perspective of humanity's journey. This is Africa. This is African history. Tonight, though, we journey back to pre-colonial Africa, before cars, before national borders drawn by colonizers who, for the most part, ignored thousands of years of social, political, commercial, and ethnic history. This pre-colonial history does indeed dwarf our preconceived notions. So let us begin our journey. Vitali Bueno. May you have a good journey. Moni Bwanji.
Deli bueno, caieinos.
Ndili Bueno Imso. Zikomo. If we chance to meet on the worn earthen paths that connect one village of thatched mud homes to another in Malawi, or if I come to you on an errand, we must first agree, acknowledge our interconnectivity, our interdependence. For such linkage, in contrast to the Western value on independence, is not only ingrained custom here, it is the Malawian understanding of what it is to be human, and it is survival. I lived in Malawi for 3 years with my husband and 2 preschool-age sons. When we arrived in 1972, this tiny landlocked country of 4 million people in East Central Africa was celebrating 10 years of independence from Great Britain with a great festival. But there were great challenges ahead. Malawi was the 3rd poorest country in the world. And by the way, if you were on this bus, you would be expected to get out and push. And it was among the least developed. This was the government school, just a short walk from our house. The death rate, and by the way, these benches were earthen. The death rate for children under 5 ranged from 50 to 80%. Our job at Lakuni Boys Secondary School is teachers, as well as the others in our organization, such as doctors, nurses, dentists, etc., was to make ourselves obsolete, to educate and help Malawi achieve its goals, so that the teachers, the doctors, the nurses, the leaders of the next generation would be Malawians. The Malawian government made sure, before issuing us work permits, that we would meet this criteria of making ourselves obsolete. And indeed, in this photo, you will see our replacements and more, including the United Nations and the ambassador to the United Nations and to the United States, our student, Stephen Matenji. The school was controlled by the government, but maintained and staffed at its request by the Marist brothers and other Roman Catholic orders. We were sent for 3 years rather than 2 or 1 because we were told by the organization that sent us, we see things through the prism of a Western culture. We will inevitably misinterpret Africa as seen through this prism, they said, even though we had 9 months of training and language before embarking. So the first year they told us, just keep your mouth shut. Listen and observe. It was great advice. This cultural prism that can distort and ignore also applies to Western interpretation of African history, including pre-colonial history, which is the topic of my paper tonight. Thank you, Jeff, for asking me to speak on this topic, which is near and dear to my heart, but for which I feel woefully inadequate given the scope of the topic. However, because of its relative lack of westernization due to its isolated geography and lack of resources such as copper and gold that had attracted outsiders to other areas of Africa, and because the Malawi government stressed the preservation of African traditions, our life in Malawi, our life as a family, allowed us to see, smell, taste, grieve, and rejoice at what Africa was like before colonization. It was a great and humbling privilege. We learned far more than we taught. Although there are immense differences in pre-colonial kingdoms and events on the huge continent of Africa, Malawi can serve in fundamental ways as a template for pre-colonial history of most of Africa. First, let us go far back to our own roots, in all likelihood, 2.3 million years ago, to the Great Rift Valley, in the southern part of which is Lake Malawi. And you all know where the Great Rift Valley is. It goes through here. There's Lake Malawi down here. Here's where we live. Voila. And the Great Rift Valley. I know it's a little low. So, voila, the Great Rift Valley. Here in Tanzania is immediately north of Lake Malawi, and here is where archaeologists, most prominently, as you know, Mary and Louis Leakey, found evidence of social and intellectual capacity, including the use of stone tools in communal activity. Now, this was at a time when Europe and the Americas were still in the Mesozoic age. 2 sites in Ethiopia are the earliest sites of early modern humans. Advancement continued. 8,000 years before Christ, this is why I say it was a broad topic, the yam was domesticated in West Africa, and 7,000, the Cushites also were growing millet. The city-state of Carthage in the 4th century BC, that's about the time of classical Greece, I believe, was one of the largest metropolises in the world, and the center of the Carthaginian Empire that dominated the western Mediterranean area, included southern Spain. And their government had elements of democracy as well as oligarchy, and even had a system of checks and balances. So we can't say there was just a blank page here. Meanwhile, the Sahara area had been drying since about 2,000 years before Christ. This cut off much of Africa from the explosive development in the Middle East, where agriculture, writing, and metallurgy were undergoing major advances. In addition, the harsh environment and generally poorer soils of Africa discouraged innovation and experimentation in agriculture. Many scholars believe this led to the preference for traditional systems of agriculture, which are more communal, for optimum survival. Central Africa, including Malawi, have tsetse flies, which weaken livestock and humans. They couldn't have horses, for example, in Malawi. Diseases from malaria to measles, which I caught in Malawi, very devastating. Bilharzia greatly weaken people, even if it does not kill them. But Africa is strong and it's inventive. Papyrus was invented in about 2,800 in Nubian Nile, where the great kingdom of Kush was arising. One of papyrus's many uses was for hieroglyphics, you know, and of course, its Rosetta Stone was not discovered until the 19th century. We Westerners and many others had the impression that Africa had no written languages. This remnant of the Nubian script dates back to about 900 AD. But let's go back to Kush. Kush's ancient cities dotted the Nile. Kush built pyramids that can still be seen today. Most Kushites were farmers, grew wheat, barley, and cotton, which they made clothing. Kush traded heavily with other kingdoms, including Egypt, in iron, gold, ivory, some slaves, incense, wild animal hides, and emeralds. I had never heard of Kush when I was in high school and even early college. Kushites traveled as far as the Persian Gulf and across the Red Sea. As Egypt declined, Kush ruling powers rose and eventually conquered Egypt all the way to the Mediterranean. Kush lasted more than 1,000 years. In West Africa, meanwhile, Saharan trade routes were beginning to make inroads across the sand by the time of Alexander in 250 BC. But it was not until the camel was introduced into Africa in around 200 AD that commerce began to flourish in West Africa. Meanwhile, for about as long as the Sahara was drying up, Bantu people were migrating east from the Niger area into the Congo region and eastward, possibly in search of fertile land and water. These Iron Age Bantu people found Stone Age pygmies living there, and whose carvings we actually saw in caves in Malawi, walking around. So let's migrate east with the Bantu. The eastern coast of Africa has been the focal point of major international trade since back to the time of the Phoenicians. A thriving trade between the coast and the Sahari Arabs of Persia existed as far back as 100 AD. The trade revolved around goods from the interior of Africa, including gold, ivory, and copper, brought to the coast, then taken across the Indian Ocean in boats called dhows. The middlemen in these Swahili city-states were a blend of Arab and Bantu people. That were springing up these cities were springing up along the coast of the Indian Ocean. By the 10th and the 11th centuries, kingdoms in the interior were consolidating. Can you see this
No.
map? Am I pointing to nothing?
Sorry to see. I
Okay.
can see it.
Anyway, in the interior down here, we're talking about this region, by the 10th and 11th centuries, kingdoms in the interior region were consolidating socially, politically, and commercially. In response to the demand for ivory, gold, and other goods that were dominant raw products there. The Shona is one of the largest and most complex such kingdoms in pre-colonial southern Africa, in what is now the Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Zambia state. Arising in the 11th century, Zimbabwe kingdoms controlled from the trade from the interior to the coast for hundreds of years. Shona's capital, Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe, and this, of course, is just the ruins, is the largest stone structure in pre-colonial southern Africa. The king, called the Mambo, taxed other chiefs and headmen through the region of over 150 tributaries headquartered in their own minor Zimbabwe's. Like smaller states in that area that had preceded them, such as the Mapungubwe, the Shona mined gold, copper, and iron, and they kept cattle. There were full-time specialists in ceramic, pottery, and gold, and blacksmithing. The Shona are known for their soapstone sculptures, which often depict the transformation of spirits. It's sort of a Shona style, and are often abstract. A Zimbabwe burial site discovered by a Boer farmer in 1932 and later found to date back to the 11th century hints at the vast wealth of this kingdom. One grave contains the skeleton of a woman with at least 100 gold bangles around her ankles and at least 1,000 gold beads in her grave. The male, probably a king, is buried in the traditional Bantu style with
Back away from the speaker.
with his legs drawn up to his chest and arms folded around his knees. With them were gold objects, including the lions and rhinos. Succeeding the Zimbabwe with the Matapa Empire. By the time the Portuguese arrived on the Mozambique coast in the 16th century, Mutapa was the premier state, covering vast territories all the way to the Indian Ocean, in what are now Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa, and probably Malawi. The Mutapa ruler Moana Mutapa controlled trade, especially gold, and exacted a duty of 50% on all goods imported. The Portuguese pushed back. They had to comply, though, and they even had to pay homage to him. In 1569, King Sebastian of Portugal made a grant of arms to the Moana Mutapa. This Chinese Should we get up and sing? Yeah. Show and show, the Malawians would say.
There we go. Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Show and show. This Chinese teapot from a Mutapa site shows far-reaching extent of the Zimbabwe Mutapa Shona trade. The Moanan Mutapa ruled a number of chiefs, sub-chiefs, and headmen. Armies were well organized. The religion revolved around ritual consultation with spirits and ancestors. Shrines in the city were maintained by spirit mediums called Mohandora, who also served as oral historians. And of course, art was part of their life. It wasn't a separate entity. Succeeding the Mutapa in this area was the Razwi kingdom in Shangamir on Okay. Succeeding Mutapa in this area was the Razwi kingdom, which covered a vast area south of the Zambezi. The legendary leader of the Razwi was Shangamiri, who was able to repel the armed Portuguese militia in 1683 using just traditional spears and shields. I shouldn't say just. Oral tradition says that Shangamiri had supernatural powers, able to turn a white cow into a red one. His name became the honor name of all kings who followed him. Honor names are a tradition in many parts of Africa, even when we were there, and so part of the pre-colonial culture. Malawi's leader at the time, the nation's first, Hastings Banda, when we were there, we had to always refer to him as the Ingwazi, meaning chief of chiefs, great lion. So even in private settings, we had to call him His Excellency, the Life Presidency, the Ingwazi, Dr. H. Kamuzu Banda. Although sometimes if we had a little bit too much Portuguese wine from Mozambique, we'd call him H.E. His Excellency. The Moravic Veterans, as you can see, this is Lake Malawi, and that's where we live. Ooh, just above my index finger.
Pretty much in the middle.
Malawi is small, but the Moravic Confederacy in the 1700s covered not just where Malawi is now, but all the way to the Indian Ocean. And that's really where Malawi gets its name. Malawi is just a tiny country, but that's as far as their empire once reached. It includes Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique. The Portuguese never were able to wrest control of trade away from the Moravi, ever. And north of that, there were other kingdoms. The Ngonde founded a kingdom in about 1600. And in this era, the communities advanced their agricultural practices and grew crops such as corn, cassava, and rice. The Luba and the Lunda in the Congo region, west of where you're looking, are more examples of states with concentrations of political authority, a division of labor, and wealth accumulation. So there were ancient, long-standing, and sophisticated international trade routes, socio-political consolidation, and the ascent of states in southern Africa. So claims later, including by the Dutch-speaking farmers, the Boers, that these lands were open and free for the taking is true only through our Western prism. While monuments survive of Egypt, Kush, and Zimbabwe in where we've been looking in more East and Central Africa, much evidence of the civilizations in West Africa and the Central Savannah have been hidden by the windblown spread of the Sahara. And the fact that lacking stone, architecture was created from adobe. Archaeologists are, however, still discovering that there was so much more intellectually, artistically, and commercially and administratively than meets the eye and that we have known. Just as in East Africa, interior kingdoms in West Africa consolidated politically and economically in response to the demand for gold, ivory, and other goods. For instance, the kingdom of Kalamazoo in the central Sudan area around Lake Chad lasted about 1,000 years until the mid-19th century. Not just military power, but administrative finesse, managing the Saharan trade routes, maintained the successful dynasty. Ordinary people farmed wheat, millet, and sorghum. Pomegranates, peaches, and grapes grew in the royal gardens. Citrus fruits were abundant, perhaps introduced by the Arabs. And cotton, perhaps introduced by way of India, was made into clothing. To its west of Kalamazoo, Ghana, at the height of its power, controlled a territory from the desert on the north to the Niger Valley on the south. From 300 AD, for more than 800 years, a glittering palace housed successive kings who were paid tribute by lesser chiefs out in the bush, as we would say in Africa, who these lesser chiefs more or less ruled the way they wanted to. The market centers of the Saharan trade routes were developed in Ghana, most notably Djenne and Timbuktu. When Ghana fell in the 11th century, the Kingdom of Mali ascended, expanded Ghana's territory, and fostered further growth of its commercial centers. By the 12th century, Djenne was one of the great commercial centers of the known world. But you would not know it by looking at this postcard from the early 20th century, because its splendor had been weathered away, and they pretty much overlooked it in history. Now that it has been restored and maintained every year, it is easier to picture Djenne at what recent excavations are revealing. A city about twice the size of London at the time, bustling with activity. Gold from enormous caravan routes of about up to 12,000 camels was sold, along with prized products from the outlying states. Brass workings, wood carvings, and fine kente cloth from the Ashanti, and blankets from the mountains. The markets of the middle of the places such as Djenne, even as early as in the 11th century, according to one Islamic traveler and geographer, were a cacophony of many languages and music, percussions and aromas from leather workers, mat weavers, horse traders, potters, barbers, tailors, and food vendors. As you can see from these photos, which are current, of course, So many of the traditions and feel of Africa are still very much alive today. Besides being a major hub of commerce, Timbuktu was renowned for its Sankore Mosque University that had 25,000 students by the 14th century. So you can truly say we have gone from Kalamazoo to Timbuktu. Based on Arab scholarship and Islamic values, Sankore had one of the largest libraries in the world at the time, with between 500,000 and 750,000 manuscripts. The basic levels taught reading and writing. At the university level were mathematics, physics, chemistry, history, ethics, jurisprudence, and astronomy, and more. A doctor's degree equivalent took about a decade of specialization, guided by the top scholars of the day. The diverse population of Timbuktu lived together peacefully, according to historians. A lively city full of book traders, scholars, calligraphers, librarians, and others. Perhaps there was a torch Timbuktu. Mali endured until the 15th century. In the 17th century, with the invasion of Morocco and later of the French, these surviving manuscripts were hidden mostly underground by a few dedicated families. And even now, they are only being slowly brought out for and they are crumbling with age for digitization and translation. Mali's successor, Songhai, dominated for another nearly 200 years in an area greater than that of West Europe at the time. And it sustained unity until it too fell to the Moroccans. Now, Africa has never been, and still is not, just a man's world. The most important ruler of the Hausa in the 15th centuries was a woman. In the busy cities such as Jenne and Timbuktu, women had freedom that shocked visitors. Ashanti women could inherit property. When could we inherit property as women in the United States? The kingdom of Dahomey lasted from 1600 until 1904, perhaps in part because of her all-woman militia, known for its ferocity, tenacity, and organization. There were also strong women military leaders among the Yoruba. These were the Amazon women you sometimes hear about from West Africa. Many African societies were and are matriarchal. This is true with the largest ethnic group in Malawi, where the husband moves to the bride's village and the bride's brother assumes most of the responsibilities for his sister's children. It is the oldest woman in the village who is considered the wise one. She, Yagogo, has the place of honor in the center of the dance circle, the dust rising from her bare feet, stepping to the beat of many drums. I should have retired. In the 19th century, centuries-old social and commercial patterns were rent by seismic shifts across Africa. People were forced to migrate due to crippling droughts, and in Central Africa, in addition to some droughts, there were the fearsome Zulu and their legendary leader, Shaka. The Zulu, in turn, were in part responding to pressure for land from the Boer farmers. But it was a burgeoning slave trade that had disrupted Africa that was disrupting Africa almost beyond repair. In East and Central Africa, the slave trade began to mushroom in the late 1700s to feed the French Indian Ocean plantations. The Arabs of Oman dominated the East African slave trade, using the many Swahili communities up and down the East Coast. These are slaves that were rescued from a dhow by a British Navy ship, because the British were officially fighting slavery by the 1840s. With the indigenous Yao, the slavers pushed deep into the interior with armed caravans, sweeping into villages, capturing people and driving them to the coast to be marketed for slavery in Arabia, the Persian Gulf, and India, as well as plantations in Brazil and Zanzibar. The slavers had ways of making villages turn away on one another, and corrupted leaders fractured traditional customs and shattered the local and regional economy. Some tribes allied with the British for protection in the Malawi area because by then Britain was solidly abolitionist, fired in part by the vivid descriptions and sketches such as this one by explorer and missionary David Livingstone, who recorded the terrible raids and hideous slave markets on the shores of Lake Malawi. And his verbal descriptions of the dead and the dying that he found along the way are incredible. Livingston and his comrades paid a terrible price for exposing the slave trade in Malawi and related areas. Here is a graveyard that our family literally stumbled on while hiking around the southern end of Lake Malawi. We found 23 graves, most of young people in their 20s and 30s, with the names of doctors and others in Livingston's party. The slave trade likewise poisoned West Africa. There had been slavery in Sudan by the 10th century. Slavery was recognized by Islam. But by the 19th century, it had evolved into a much larger and more destructive force in order to feed the plantations in the United States and elsewhere. For instance, 4,000 souls were reported to have been brought in one night to Chad, one city in Chad alone. Some 10 to 20,000 people a year were stacked onto ships for the trip across the Atlantic. The impact on the African socio-political traditions was profound. Some major West Africa states, such as the Ashanti and Dahomey, became more centralized and military as they evolved into primarily slave and ivory trade in the 18th century. In formerly peaceful fishing villages in the Niger Delta, the village headmen became more powerful and autocratic from the local control of the slavery commerce. This weakened Africa was thus vulnerable to colonialism in the 19th century. Now, I've mentioned just a fraction of the cities and organized states and kingdoms across Africa over the millennium. Because they had differentiated social and political classes, because they valued wealth production and created structures of which we have at least some faint archaeological record. These kingdoms, through our Western prism, glitter like gold. But through Africa's historic prism, her heart has always lain in the village. It is a world of subsistence farming and the extended family, where its wealth is sharing, respect for elders and ancestors, traditions, and the spirit world. Here with short-handled hoes, kasu in Malawi, they're called kasu in Malawi, the villagers draw life from the soil. Here they store grain in the nkokwe, a straw structure they weave to hold the key to life until the rainy season begins again. Here the women swing up and down the ntondo, pounding the grain to the rhythm of their song. And I found it was not as easy as it may look. Ntondo, very hard. And here, especially at harvest, you can hear the drumming from the villages at night and see huge woven weed structures of spirit animals. We would see these, in fact, this photo on the dirt path behind our home as they made their way to the Nyao dance. The Nyao dancing goes far into the night, the dancers taking on the spirits of animals or other spirits. But the hum of ordinary life is really the music of Africa. Weekly, they meet at the market. Here is the market where we shop, just a short walk behind our homes. On the lake shores, women pound the cassava. Men mend their nets that they will use to fish from hollowed out logs as they have for 1,000 years or more. From the village headman to the forest widow, there are few visible differentiations in wealth. A display of wealth is not where their values lie, but it is in community. Houses are not prized for show, but for utility. This is the home of our student, Nasser Kamazar. He built it himself in his village, as all young men are expected to do when they are 16. Self-sufficiency is the pre-colonial way of life. Build a house, weave a mat, grow one's food. Here is Nasser with his dad. I found myself feeling rather incompetent and helpless compared to the pre-colonial lifestyle of self-sustenance. This is not to glorify such a lifestyle. The darkness so close to the equator is literally and figuratively in Africa an inky blackness. Before the billowing, tall cumulus clouds finally open October, causing people to break into singing and dancing, marking the coming of the rains, the nkokways often become empty. People routinely lose 20 pounds in the dry season. The death rate from malaria and other parasitic diseases soars. And yes, pre-colonial Africa had minimal variations in wealth and social structure in the traditional village. However, if you find a way to get more yield from your maize so that you must build a larger nkokwe than your neighbor, and you do not share it, your nkokwe may mysteriously burn down one night. Or you may be bewitched by the witch doctor and fall very ill. Jealousy is the other darker side of the coin of equality. The Malawi national anthem implores, "Save us from hunger, disease, and envy." An evil spirit in Chichewa is called Mpipi. When John Chingoga, our next door neighbor, the father of our children's best friend, here's our son Dan with Masa Chingoga, and a fellow teacher who was our best friend, was killed in what appeared to be an accident. Even the most educated Malawians assumed he had died because somebody who was jealous of him had gone to a witch doctor. You may not have Nfiti in the United States, John's wife, Virginia, a college-educated herself, and my best friend told me. We were sitting on the floor of her front porch, mourning John's death. But we have Nfiti in Malawi. But the beauty of pre-colonial life in Africa far outshines its darkness. Pre-colonial culture is generous, especially to strangers. One of their many wise sayings is, Mwami Ndimau, visitors are like the morning dew. In other words, they are precious, but they will still be gone, so value them. Walking through a village one day, when we were walking through a village one day, a widow, probably the one with the least in the village, held up to us in her cupped hand, as customary, a single egg. I am sorry, she said, that I only have one egg to give you. When my two elderly aunts visited us in the United States, the nearby village in Galway honored them with a dance. But they most honored my oldest aunt, while apologizing to my younger one that she was receiving fewer gifts. In the United States, this younger aunt was the prettier sister. She was sort of a cutie. My Aunt Dorothy, the older one, she was a little dowdy. This is Aunt Dorothy. But it was Dorothy, Malawians honored, with the most gifts and dances. She, they said, is the Agogo. In all our years of teaching, never one word of rudeness was spoken to us by a student. For to do so would be chipongwe, or rudeness, which especially to an old elder is anathema in the Chewa culture. A few days after John Chingoga's death, still shocked at his loss, but also mourning the fact that I would be losing my best friend because she, according to custom, would have to return to her village as a widow, one of my students met me on the path. Class had been canceled because of John's death. I was sitting on a rock by myself. Madam, he said, stopping as you would, and with your hands together, I am so sorry for your loss. I know Virginia was your friend. Different sides of the globe, he brought up in a mud hut with a thatched roof, and I in suburban Cleveland. Different generations, different genders, different cultures. But his empathy, his generosity of spirit made us one. On the day we were to leave Africa, we sat on our front porch, and they came to say goodbye. One woman held out her hands with small scones that she had baked, wrapped in a cloth. She envisioned us traveling the way she would travel, on her feet for many days, needing to carry our food. For your long journey, she said. And so the pre-colonial history of Africa in many ways is the history of human journey, the human soul, the dark and the light, the mighty and the humble. It is the University of Timbuktu and the gardens of King Bornu, the pyramids of Egypt and Kush, and the massive stone walls of the great Zimbabwe. But it is just as surely the small villages and the worn dirt paths that line between them, where a widow might give you her last egg, and a stranger paused on his way or her way and offered a calloused hand to greet you. Moni Uliwanji. Zikom.
Thank you, Barbara. Wonderful presentation and from the heart. Yeah, very touching. So I'm sure there are some comments and questions for the wonderful torch presentation.
I'm going to get a drink of water.
I don't think this one's been used.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Barbara, I was wondering during the period of time that you and Jim spent in your family in Broadway, was the Catholic Church attempting to convert the local population to Catholicism, or does this precede the Malawi situation or following?
The government very strictly controlled. You could not come into Malawi to convert people. First of all, they really valued the traditions. You had to be a teacher, a doctor, a dentist. You had to somehow contribute to that country school. And that was, like, we had to wait for our work permits to come through for 2 months. We'd already sold our house in California. And so we stayed with his parents for about 2 months in Detroit, waiting for our work permits to come through. So it was entirely up to the government, and you had to be abused to them. I would say no. We, as lay people, our job was to do what we did, teach. Jim was a science teacher, so he was an engineer. We didn't try to convert people, but we did. We tried to live our faith. We are people. We are Catholic. We tried to live our faith to see other people's brothers and to live our faith, but not try to say that our way was better than. Well, you go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to say that the Malawi government encouraged the churches to come in. The churches provided most of the health care, most of the education, and most of the technological advancements that occurred in the country. And Malawi was roughly, it was a third Catholic, third Protestant, and a third Muslim. Well, and then there's a lot of the traditional religion as well. So I guess there's more than 3/3 there. But anyway, it was kind of evenly divided between Catholic, Protestants, and mostly Muslims. So, and like I say, the Malawi government encouraged the churches to come in because they had so few resources. I mean, that was the big discovery that I made when I got there, and I wondered, why don't they do this? Why don't they do that? I came to realize there's no money. There is no money. I mean, there were no resources. It was quite a...
Well, and the Malawans are spiritual people, so they have their own spiritual life. David?
Waiting for the mic.
Oh, you don't need it.
Oh, I use it anyway.
Okay.
I may have missed it, but would you describe the subject matter that you and Jim were teaching over those 3 years? Was it partly the English language or no?
No, I taught actually African history, in which I was about 2 weeks ahead of my students and scrambling to learn it myself. Oh my Lord. And I mean, that's the first time I had heard of push when I taught it to my students. And world history. In teaching world history, I was very conscious in teaching about totalitarianism rise in Europe because I felt here is this young country, baby country. These students are probably going to include some of the leaders in the future generation. I want them to know the mistakes that have been made in the past in the signs of totalitarianism. And so that was very meaningful to me to teach that. And so that's why I taught. And go ahead. And he taught science.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I taught math and physics and chemistry.
Here.
I taught English and
No, I did not teach English.
primarily African history. But
What did you teach?
we in the primary schools are taught in their native language until 4th grade, and there's 9 different languages spoken in Malawi, which is a small country. It's only about the size of Michigan. But there's nine different languages spoken in the country. Through 4th grade, the students learn in their native language, and then it was a former British colony. So starting in 4th grade, if they're going beyond that, they learn in their native language, plus the 2 national languages, which were Chichewa, the language of the largest tribe, and English. So they advanced beyond 4th grade, and only about 4% of the school kids got selected to go to secondary school.
It's by a test. They take a government test.
So the students at the secondary school level were all smart kids. I mean, they were the top 4% of the country. And then if they graduated from secondary school, once again, only about 4% got to go to university level.
Did most of the teaching occur in the high school in English?
Yes, we taught in English.
Yes. And one incident, Jim was teaching about electricity and lightning, and the students, yes, and as I say, these are students that had passed a government test, but they said, oh, but Mr. Walters, this is true, but there are people in our village who can create lightning. So yes, they believed in, the world as, from our Western culture, but they also believe and still believe. I mean, we are still in contact via Facebook with some of our students, and they still go to these village dances where the structures and the meow dancers. They still love their culture, and many of them are Catholic too. They don't see there isn't really a conflict. It's a different spiritual forms of your life. And yes.
So with regard to the concept of shaman, so Nancy and I, my wife, had friends who were in New Guinea for about 20 years. And we have another friend who traveled throughout South America, in particular, befriended Yanomama Indians. And one of which, a guy named Shoefoot, who's now deceased, but he authored a book. An American, Brent Ritchie, actually is credited as the author, but it's written by Shoefoot, which gives you insight into the life of a Yanomama Indian. But it's an interesting phenomena that this concept of witch doctor or shaman shows up everywhere around the world.
I'm sure it's even in our culture in some form.
And when I read the book, it's called Spirit of the Rainforest, the most unique book I've ever read. So it's well worth reading if you're interested in something like this.
Mm-hmm.
They had a belief, and it sounds like you alluded to this, that if someone died in their village, it wasn't just disease, it was likely a witch doctor in another village causing that, and so they would go to war as a result. But it sounds like when you were there, Islam was there, Christendom had been there, so you had outside influence already. But did you? My curiosity is just: did you see anything that indicated that, or do you think you just saw the residuals of that kind of belief system?
I don't think it was Christianity or Islam that influenced their through the witch doctor. I felt, and I may be wrong, that they were pretty consistent in believing that, okay, we can believe in Islam, we can believe in some form of Christianity, but there are witch doctors. I mean, we had students, perfectly just logical, people sitting right in the second desk and said, Mr. Walters, I have to go back to my village, I've been bewitched. I have to go to the witch doctor to be cured. So then he came back and he was better 2 months later. So I think that was pretty, of course, Malawi had been pretty isolated all along. And I don't think it was mitigated in any way by Islam or Christianity. I think that was pretty much. Do you agree with that, Jim, or no? Yeah.
It was kind of like added on instead of changed. Was it kind of like added on to what they were, their beliefs that they originally had? Okay, there's this, and now there's this too. It's both and rather than either or.
Yeah, it was like the Old Testament and the New. Like, for example, in the Catholic churches, the Incoque, which contained life, was the vessel in which they felt in which they stored the blessed sacrament. And so they didn't piecemeal. There was a flow. There was a flow there. And show, they would say. I mean, they were very, they were spiritual people. Anyway, you can see the way they acted. They led a spiritual life. Yes, Mike.
Barbara, excuse me. I enjoyed your talk. Very nice.
Thank you.
May I just make a little comment about? Make a little comment. Based on the genetic information that we have today, how the genes are spreading and branching, we human 5 million years ago branched out from chimpanzee, and the first person who walked on this planet on 2 feet, bipedal walkers, were in Africa, in Savannah. Furthermore, Neanderthal, close to 150,000 years ago, migrated from eastern part of Africa, going through the Red Sea, part went to Asia, part went to Persia, Iran, and part went to Mediterranean part, and they lasted up until 40,000 years ago. Homo sapien, which we all are, 80,000 years ago left Africa. And in Carmel, which is in present Israel, some mated with Neanderthal. As a result, 2 to 4% of genes in European and partly in Iranian and Asian are Neanderthal genes. The only part that doesn't have Neanderthal genes is in Africa, because they are pure African. They didn't go anywhere to mate. The same Homo sapien essayed from east coast of Africa, went to the west coast of Africa. So if you talk about the glory, I would say Africa is a very glorious continent. It's the mother of all of us, where we all came from. So I have an awful lot of respect for Africa. And I hope my comment had some impact. Nice talk.
I felt that too, in so many ways, and many people feel that way, that there's a soul, there's something, as I say, you touched the soul, and we were so fortunate to be there. Thank you for your beautiful comments. Jack?
Well, I'm sure you had an intention to learn a great deal when you went there, and I know that you learned a lot. I'd like you to tell us what was the dominant thing that you feel part of your view of life that was changed on account of your stay in Africa? What kind of shifted in terms of your orientation? If you thought about it that way.
The words that come to my mind are gratitude, humbleness. These people had nothing materially in comparison to us, and yet they were equal or superior spiritually and emotionally. For example, the children, their generosity, their first instinct is to give to their other children, to help each other. Our children, after they'd been there a couple of years, and of course they began to speak Chichewa as their first language, we got some candy from Jim's mom at Easter time. This was after about 2 years, and I think their kids are about 4, Michael's about 5. And they opened this box, it's got chocolate and stuff you can't get in Africa. What do? They run out the front door and they shout, Animata, Animata, and they call the other children to give it away. Why? Because that's how people are there. They give, they're communal, they share, they're happy. That's what makes them happy. And then when we came back, we moved back to Michigan, and we had this house in Otsego. And the first month or so, they couldn't believe it, because this is mine. The other children, this is mine. Our kids didn't know that concept yet. Now, it didn't take them long to learn. Trust me. It lasted about 2 months. But it was incomprehensible to them, that your first thing, like the woman with the egg. That's what I learned. Let
me just add, I guess I would say in fewer words, we were humbled by the generosity of the people. It was just, it made us, I guess that's the best way I can say it. We were just humbled by their generosity, and despite being some of the poorest people on earth.
Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful and moving and educational presentation. This is what church is all about. So, well, thank you for coming tonight, and have a happy holiday. Next month, yes, and we will be back in January, the third Wednesday, January 16th. Our speaker then will be Jack Urban with his topic, Adventures of Architects and Their Clients. So this should be a fascinating experience. So happy holidays, happy New Year, Merry Christmas, but happy Hanukkah, happy Kwanzaa, right? And to all a good night.
Andy, I'm thinking maybe one of those planes. One?
Yeah, she was turning away from the whole time.
I noticed that.
I tried it when I was giving you mine, and it just felt weird having that.
I'm used to it, I'm sure.
I know. I just still don't the Broadway ones on the forehead. I want to try one of those at some point just to see how that feels. Right? You've seen those.
Good to see you.
Usually for women, they usually put them on their face. It's harder for the man.
Yeah.
But it always looks like some sort of growth.
I know. First time I saw those, I'm like, what is wrong with his head?
No,
It doesn't make any sense.
Happy holiday. Happy holiday.
You did well too.